Okay, everyone, it's that time. Welcome to the second installment of our three-part webinar series with Intertech Alchemy. My name is Jonathan Lackey, and on behalf of the Safe Quality Food Institute, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Critical Risk Mitigation Strategies for Your Ever-Changing Supply Chain. Again, a brief bit of housekeeping. All lines will be in listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar, but we do want to hear from you. So again, please post your questions in the chat, and we'll get to as many as possible during the Q&A. Please take note of our antitrust statement, which has been provided to you. Conversations regarding price fixing, boycotting, trade restrictions, or other violations of anti-trade are to be avoided. If you believe that the conversation is in violation of the antitrust law, please speak up and we will do the same. As we discuss this important topic of critical risk mitigation strategies, we'd like to draw your attention to the SQF Risk Collection Training Series we developed in conjunction with Intertech Alchemy. Delivered on their Zosi platform, this online, self-paced, 7-course bundle dives into critical food safety risk areas and best practices. And there is a free risk exam included. Oh, sorry, I'm a little bit off on my... Okay, there we go. All right, again, our North America SQF Focus Day is just a few weeks away and coming up on September 13th. The theme for this virtual event is Recall Readiness and Prevention, with speakers from Costco, McDonald's, Intertech Alchemy, and more. Mark your calendars. SQF Unites is coming to New Orleans, March 11th through the 14th. We are actively working on the agenda for the event, and registration will open next month. Looking forward to seeing everyone there. Again, today's presentation is the second installment in our three-part webinar series. The first was held last week and is now available on demand, and the last will be held September 6th. With that, I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers, Laura Dunn-Nelson and Jeff Chilton with Intertech Alchemy. As the Vice President of Food Safety and Sustainability for Alchemy, Laura has over 35 years experience implementing food safety and quality control programs for processing, packaging, food service, and retail operations. Jeff is a registered SQF consultant and Vice President of Consulting for Alchemy with over 30 years of experience in the food industry, specializing in food safety, quality assurance, and plant management. Now that you've gotten to know our presenters, I'm going to turn it over to them. Take it away, Lauren and Jeff.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks so much. Gosh, what an honor and pleasure to be presenting today. Thank you to SQF for this opportunity. And always a pleasure to be co-presenting with Jeff. So thanks, Jeff. Yeah, if we go to our next slide, we're going to cover this all-important topic of supply chain risk mitigation. We've seen this in the news and time again. It's a struggle for many of us to stay on top of our supply chain and really have a resilient supply chain. So we're going to talk about strategies for risk management. We're going to talk about if you can go back one slide, we're going to talk about the tool risk assessment that can really help us with this. We're going to discuss quite a few best practices. So keep your pencil handy. You will get these slides at the end, but if something triggers, you might want to jot it down. We're going to go over regulatory requirements because that really can be a challenge for us, especially in this global world of ours. We're going to talk about supplier approval, the importance of that, and verification. And then we hope to receive lots of your questions. So check out that chat line and send those questions our way. All right, so let's get started. So in our last, this is our second webinar. In our first webinar, we talked about the importance of risk mindset for our teams in our facilities. So throughout the organization, including our frontline employees, including our leadership, and everybody in between, and how important it is to have that risk mindset. Now we're going to step away from our basically floors, walls, and ceilings and talk about that supply chain and applying that risk mindset to the supply chain. So if we go to the next slide, I think it's important to really keep in mind what we're trying to prevent. So we're looking to prevent product that's out of spec. And this can include biological, chemical, physical contaminants, just unfit for use. Maybe it's spoiled, maybe it's out of temp, and then just unexpected substitutions, right? So product that is not what we expected out to be. Sometimes we focus on that and as our supply chain program, but the truth is there can be delays to supply chain for many other reasons, and it could be natural disasters, could be cyber attacks, lots of examples of that of late, sourcing delays of any kind, and then transportation. So we have to think about the broader approach to the supply chain and what we can do to build more resiliency. So if you go to the next slide, how do we do it? How do we build that resiliency? It's easy to talk about, but much harder to do. So it's all about risk mitigation. So we learned in our prior webinar that risk mitigation is really understanding those risks and threats, accepting that they exist out there in the world, and taking the appropriate measures to reduce their effects. So in this case, we have two approaches. One is intrinsic, what we do internally to address risk mitigation, and externally, the extrinsic approach. And we use those tools: risk transfer, risk monitoring, and risk avoidance. So let me give you some examples if we go to the next slide. So for the extrinsic activities, we're going to transfer the risk over to our suppliers. And so that's where those certificate of analysis comes into play. So we want those certificate COAs to be completed by those suppliers and delivered appropriately and on time. We want them to adhere to all the legal and regulatory requirements that meets or exceeds industry standards. We want the ingredient statement and noted allergen presence if applicable. We want to make sure that they adhere to those specifications. And, I think it's important to talk about specifications as in, this is not a COA that they decide to give to us. This is an agreed upon a series of tests and requirements that together makes up that certificate of analysis. Make sure that we have acceptable storage conditions, and those are agreed upon, and then the whole transportation aspect, and making sure that that transportation is done in a sanitary manner and timely manner. So those are those requirements we try to put onto those suppliers. If we go to the next slide, the intrinsic activities that we have, the risk monitoring is, we're going to double check. We're going to double check those COAs, and we're going to test product to make sure that the results we're receiving actually matches what we get in our testing. And we do that at a certain level, depending on our risk tolerance. We're going to monitor the performance of the ingredients, and we're going to look at all kinds of data from the supplier, including audit results and documentation to ensure compliance. And all of that is very important to do, because the on-site, we may have to, in addition to reviewing the audit data and asking the supplier to send that to us, we may want to do on-site audits depending on the rank of that risk of that particular supplier. And then we want to establish the communication schedules. What is that give and take in that communication, and make that a more formal process? We can talk about more reasons why in just a moment. Risk avoidance is what we use when we just can't tolerate the risk. We've got to do something that just drives that risk away. And in some cases, we may have a supplier that, despite all the effort we put into it, all the communication and discussions, we may have to change the supplier, right? Because they present just too big a risk for us. We've got to ensure an onboarding process, a really robust onboarding process for those suppliers. Share experiences and expectations. So what is it that we need from that supplier? At what frequency? What's the data sets? What's the, all of the things that go into that. And sometimes that onboarding of those suppliers is something we just don't really think about. And so we need to. At some point, we may need to reduce production levels. It may be that we're overtaxing them and we start to get non-compliances based on that and some potential risk. And so maybe we're using a smaller supplier that just can't meet our volume. Or in reverse, maybe we have to increase our volume with a particular supplier because maybe we have such a small request for production that we're small potatoes, and they say, you know what, we're not going to jump through all these hoops because you're just a tiny speck on our whole supply base, our customer base. And so we may need to increase our production in those cases. Maybe we limit certain facilities because of geopolitical issues or something. And then we have to certainly build redundancy in our supply chain. And it's all based on risk, right? So if we go to the next slide, let's talk about risk and the risk assessment, because that's our tool to be able to understand where in our supply chain, which suppliers are creating that biggest risk. If we go to the next slide, I think the whole point, and most of us know this, the whole point of those assessments is to identify the weak links. Who in our mass supply chain do we need to really focus on? We only have so much time, so much attention. So we need to know where are those biggest risks and put the majority of our time in those areas. So let's look at those assessments. And so those assessments are like any other product assessment, right? It's the likelihood of a risk, an issue occurring, the severity that it may occur, and the performance of those suppliers. And so all of that starts to create that picture for that particular supplier who's delivering that particular ingredient. And that gives us the supplier risk ranking. And so what's that criteria? Well, I've listed some there for you to consider, and some of them may be kind of new to you. So if you want to take a look at those, this is not by all means inclusive, but sometimes it is volume purchase. Maybe that's the most critical for you as part of your supply chain. If you don't get that product, then you have a risk of disruption. So maybe we need to focus on those suppliers that are providing the most product. Maybe it's the inherent risk of maybe microbial risk of an ingredient that's very sensitive, and we need to focus on those suppliers. It could be the amount we're spending could be a particular risk. If it's single sourcing, if we're single sourcing, that might be and often is a supplier that we really want to focus on, because we've got a lot of all our eggs in that basket, and we want to make sure that supplier can deliver consistently. We need to look at reputation, macroeconomic environment. We've got lots of changes in this world. Who's communicating well, and what is their performance history across the board? So we're looking and monitoring these suppliers all the way through the year. And when we get to these risk assessments annually, we need to be able to say, you know what, this one was communicating really well. They had some changeover, but they introduced us to new key contacts. The data sets were coming in appropriately. We had good feedback back and forth. Or the opposite, right? We had product disruptions. We had some delays. We had some trucks that weren't clean. And so you start to build this picture of this assessment, and then you can rank those suppliers accordingly. And the format of these assessments can be as simple as a spreadsheet. And then there's certainly software that you can purchase out there. And then third parties can help you build these risk rankings for your suppliers. Now, I will say that this is a big task. And some of you out there are saying, gosh, Laura, I've got hundreds of suppliers, and you're not alone. This can be a huge task. The key here is to do this, spend the time to do this assessment so that you can rank them and devote your time exactly where you need to be versus just firefighting or maybe spending unnecessary time with those that are delivering on time and wholesome products versus those others that you need to spend time with. If you go to the next slide, the developing this assessment and this risk ranking really takes a risk mindset. You've got to think about, what has been going on? What is their performance levels? What do we need to see? What's happening in the world that might be changing that risk? Has to be done annually and or more often, depending on where you're sourcing and maybe some of the things that are happening in the world that may be implicating into the production of your product. Definitely needs to use a cross-functional team. So this is where you start pulling in your purchasing, your finance, operations, QA, QC. All these folks have to come in, and people that are looking at the trucks every day on receiving, doing the product temperatures upon receiving, they're building a picture, right? The condition of the packaging, the on-time deliveries or not, increases in pricing, may all of that has really important information. So there's a cross-functional team that needs to come together to accurately really paint the picture for these suppliers. And there's in order to do this well, you need a continuous flow of data. And it's really capturing what is, how are we doing with these suppliers all along? Because you don't want to wait until December 1st to try to figure out what happened in January, February, March, and April. So we need to have a continuous flow of data that says, okay, yeah, this supplier continues to have a high performance. This one does not. And here's the reasons why. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to cover off just on some best practices. And so at the next slide, definitely have to focus on those highest risks. We're all so busy. It's clear that we don't have time necessarily to focus and put the same level of attention on every supplier. We do have to socialize these risk rankings across our team so that everybody's aware. And when we have purchasing saying, oh gosh, we've got a price increase, we need to source another supplier to be more competitive. Well, there's considerable effort that needs to go into that thinking on measuring and weighing that out. Jeff's going to talk a little bit more about that. We've got to leverage internal and external teams to be able to address these risk assessments and to keep those rankings updated. One of the best practices is creating those leading indicators. So when you do have some non-compliant product or some, unsanitary conditions of a truck, perhaps, or boxes that are collapsing, or whatever the case may be, some of those might be leading indicators. And so creating those so that you can build a picture proactively of these suppliers is one way to mitigate your risk and be more robust and resilient. And there's lots of things that can go into building those leading indicators. Again, utilizing a cross-functional team for that assessment, and then having that data, the data intelligence. Data speaks volumes. And so we need to be capturing just the health of those suppliers and how they're responding to meeting your expectations, whether that's COA compliance or on-time deliveries, condition, quality of product, all of those things need to be rated and monitored. And basically, it's just creating the teams of people within your organization that they are risk aware also, and building that culture. Again, your employees are another eyes and ears on, hey, this product looks a little different, or this was labeled differently, or this truck doesn't seem to be, locked and tagged or something. There could be an additional risk involved in that. So it's building that whole awareness across your organization and throughout your staff. All right, go to the next slide. Couple of trends I wanted to just point out real quick. And this is all sourced from McKinsey from April 2022. So we see some people that are moving away from just-in-time inventory to building up some reserves. And we learned a lot of lessons in the last 3 years on just this ebb and flow of product sales, and so we see some increases going on there. Certainly dual sourcing of raw materials. Single sourcing is exposure, automatically presents a risk, right? Depending on the impact to your product and production. So definitely dual sourcing, getting that secondary supplier, even tertiary suppliers. And so we see more of that. And this is interesting, this regionalizing the supply chain. We've been doing so much globally that I think people are starting to pull in and say, you know what, let's do more regional supplying if you can do that sourcing. And maybe there's more controls we can have, they're closer, we can maybe have increased communication. Maybe there's some sustainability impacts going on there too, but I thought those were interesting trends. And then digitalization and getting a more digital blueprint of your supply performance is definitely a trend. If you go to the next slide, maintaining trust, and trust is so important between you and your supplier. You need them to be able to tell you, hey, we've got a little disruption, or we're having trouble sourcing one of our raw ingredients that goes into your product that we're selling you. You need that kind of feedback so that you can build in some contingencies on your end. Transparency is really important. Even if you see your purchase volume going down, sharing that and saying, we think it's seasonal and we're going to be back up to this level, or we're shifting that product. That transparency is important. You want feedback back and forth. You need to make sure that their integrity is in place. When they have changes in personnel, phone numbers that get changed, contact names, all of that has to be done proactively. And then agreement on all those measurements, expectations, and record keeping. You go to the next slide. So keep up. You get a lot of data, I know. The important thing is to keep up with it. I was helping someone troubleshoot a particular problem when we went and looked at their raw ingredient COAs. And the COAs for a very important, I'll just say, ingredient, some of them had Salmonella negative, Listeria negative, E. coli less than 10. Others for the same product had no Salmonella results, mold and yeast less than 10, no E. coli. It was all over the board. And so I said, why aren't you consistently getting your COAs with required upon test? And they said, gosh, I didn't even know they were changing them up. We just get them and we file them. Obviously, that's not the intent of those COAs. We've got to review those. We can't make assumptions. And so it's really important that we do take and scrutinize that data. We need to look at the reputation and the health of those organizations, and that includes ESG, diversity and inclusion. We can see the impact on reputation, and there's examples out there. Changing regulations, Jeff's going to talk about this more, but an example is UK and the disruption that the whole Brexit presented. And so that definitely caused some disruption. Labor disputes that come up in trade barriers. I thought this was interesting. Countries have imposed a total of 47 export curbs on food and fertilizer since January of 2022. That's huge. And I know many of you are seeing the effects of lack of fertilizer, lack of palm oil, etc. So keeping up with those trends helps you, again, build in the resiliency. All right, go to the next slide. Jeff is going to share a supply chain and really scrutinize this regulatory requirement. So I'm going to turn this over to Jeff.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you, Jonathan, as well. It's a pleasure to be presenting with both of you again. In the next few sections, we're going to be talking about the supply chain regulatory requirements, along with the monitoring and the verification of your supply chain as well. And we all know, and we've seen in the past, where supply chain have had some huge related recalls that just made a huge impact on the food industry itself. So we can certainly look in the past to look at a lot of lessons learned through this process. But most importantly, we have to make sure that we're aware of the risks that can be associated with this, and then also to be able to make sure that we're doing everything we can to mitigate that risk as well. You know, one of the greatest examples and most unfortunate incidents that occurred that really brought this to light was the Peanut Corporation of America recall that occurred back in 2008 and 2009. Just a very unfortunate foodborne illness outbreak that resulted in over 700 illnesses and 9 deaths over 46 states throughout the United States. But when you look at all the impact along the supply chain, as well as that one company's product recalls actually triggered 3,900 other products being recalled by over 200 different companies. So it was just such a huge impact throughout the food industry itself. Just really woke everyone's eyes up to the risks that could be associated with this. It certainly called FDA's attention as well. And, you know, as they were building out the FSMA regulations and specifically the preventive control for human food and the other rules as well, then they started to think about, well, how do we design better controls for this in the future? And that's what they've done, you know, as they move forward to be able to look at, here we go. To look at the design of the preventive control for human food rule, you know, they certainly built in supply chain as a major emphasis within that rule. So when you think about the preventive controls, you can have preventive controls for process preventive controls, allergen preventive controls, sanitation preventive controls, and the fourth one is supply chain preventive controls. So we have to make sure that we address these within our food safety plans of compliance. So, you know, we really want to use the foundation of your regulatory plans, like your food safety plan, and the SQF code and the SQF best practices as well, to be able to help identify how do we assess these risks, and then how do we mitigate these risks as well. So that should be the foundation of the process that we use for this. And it all starts with a raw material hazard analysis. And notice I separate raw material from process hazard analysis. You know, most people are familiar with doing a process hazard analysis where we analyze all the hazards in each step of the process itself. But when we work with our consulting clients and teach a lot of courses, you know, we encourage you to have a separate raw material hazard analysis, you know, that'll assess each type of raw material, or at least groups of raw materials that may have similar hazards and similar controls for them as well. So you really don't overlook anything during that process. So as you look at that raw material hazard list, what you're looking for is to answer the question, is there a hazard associated with that raw material? And then if there is, then we would want to identify the risk level of that particular hazard as well. And then once we identify those raw materials with a hazard, the next step in the process is we have to identify, do we have to have a supply chain program for that particular raw material? And the answer to that question is always based on who controls the hazard. So the bottom line is, if you must rely on your supplier to control the hazard, then yes, you do have to have a supply chain program. However, if you can control the hazard in your own facility, then you wouldn't have to have one. And usually when we teach the PCQI training, I use a quick example of a bakery, that if you were concerned about salmonella and liquid pasteurized eggs that were going into a cake, does the bakery need to have a supply chain program for the liquid pasteurized eggs? And the answer is no, because they're going to formulate that with other ingredients. They're going to make the batter, pour it in a pan, put it through a baking process, and they would eliminate the potential hazard of salmonella during the baking process. So they wouldn't have to have one. But if you take that same cake a step further in the process and they cool it down, take it to a decorating department, and now you're going to add a walnuts on top of the frosting. Well, there's nothing that bakery can do to control the hazard of salmonella in the walnuts. So they have to rely on that walnut supplier to control that. So for that particular raw material, yes, they do have to have a supply chain preventive control. So we want to make sure that you truly identify, all the raw materials that should have supply chain preventive controls associated with them. And then, of course, within the preventive control for human food regulation, they give you different options to verify your suppliers. And specifically, they call out third-party audits of getting a copy of the audit report from these different facilities that's performed by a qualified auditor as well. Sampling and testing, like a COA, is certainly another method of verification. Asking for your suppliers' food safety plans or their records associated with their systems, could be another method. And then other verification methods that could be different types of inspections, or maybe you even ask for their recall and their crisis management plan as part of that as well. But really remember, it can and should definitely be more than one in some cases. So, ultimately, if you have a low or medium risk raw material, you may only be satisfied with a copy of a third-party audit report. But if you have a truly high-risk raw material, you may want to get the third-party audit report and get a COA on each incoming lot. So remember, it's all specific to the raw material and the hazard analysis associated with that. And then the last piece of this is make sure that your approved supplier lists are detailed to the point where they include not just the company name of who are you sourcing the materials from, but also the location that's actually supplying you that particular raw material. Because if you're going to use that third-party audit report as a method of verification, you're going to be able to make sure that you know which facility is supplying you that particular raw material, and that needs to correlate with your approved supplier list as well. So oftentimes companies overlook that. So be careful with it as well. And then for those companies that are importing and redistributing ingredients rather than actually processing the products themselves, then they're going to be subject to the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, or the FSVP program itself. And that rule of FSMA itself requires us to do risk assessments also. So, the first thing we have to do is determine the hazards associated with each of the food products themselves. And then the second one, and notice this, is specifically in the regulation, it tells you that you must evaluate the risk. So you're going to have to do a risk assessment. But get this, it's not just to the food, but also the supplier's performance. So you need to have a risk assessment documented of that supplier's performance as well, in addition to the risk assessment of the actual hazards associated with the food itself. And then once you determine which of those verification activities are going to be applicable, then you have to conduct those verification activities and, of course, take corrective actions as necessary as well when issues occur. I put this slide in about the FSVP program because I really want to call into attention, some of the additional regulatory emphasis on this program. And the key point is, again, based on the risk, we have to identify what that is, but also to keep in mind that you have to do a hazard analysis, not only of that food product, but of each supplier of that food product. So if you're bringing in one particular type of food, but you're buying it from 5 different suppliers, you must have an FSVP for each of those suppliers as well. And again, that's just another common area that a lot of companies overlook during that process as well. And then the last piece is to be careful not to overlook to update and perform the reanalysis when necessary as well. So at a minimum, according to the regulation, you have to update those risk assessments at least once every 3 years. And so with the implementation of the FSVP rule, many companies may be reaching that 3-year mark now. So you want to make sure you perform that reanalysis when you need to. But notice it also says, when new information becomes available. So that's why it's so important to stay alert, as we're going to talk about later as well, to make sure you know what's going on with your suppliers, with the products, and with the countries that you're importing these items from. So, if an emerging pathogen comes on place, if you become familiar with a new pathogen or a new hazard or some type of foreign material issue, those would be reasons to do reassessments as well. And then this next slide in this section, I wanted to introduce you to the FDA dashboard. If you're not familiar with this, it would be a great learning opportunity. I certainly encourage you to bookmark these on your computer itself and look at it on a regular basis as well. There's just a wealth of information here to be able to help you learn a lot. And I'm going to come back to this and reference it one more time during the verification section, so I don't want to go into all the details of it yet. But what I do want to call your attention to is, if you notice on the bottom right-hand side of this slide, notice it says developing an FSVP is actually the number 3 violation related to all food products. So that is the number 3 violation that FDA will issue a 483 warning letter that if you failed to develop an FSVP or have an inadequate hazard analysis of the food or the suppliers itself, that's one of the most common reasons why companies get 483 warning letters. And I can tell you, from a consulting basis, we see it on almost a weekly, definitely a monthly basis, to have multiple calls from companies that said, hey, I got into trouble, I didn't have an FSVP, and can you help us out here? So, make sure that you work proactively to have these in place, because FDA is putting a major emphasis on both inspecting for FSVP compliance and enforcing those requirements as well. And then in this next section, we're going to talk a little bit about the verification or the supplier approval process itself. So when you're thinking about supplier approval, we really encourage you to really take a broad perspective and look at the entire supply chain, all the way from the farm to the fork. And when you think about that, it's a very complicated and extensive process all the way through that. So we really need to look at all of it, think about where those hazards come from and how do we control them as well. But of course, it starts with the origin of the raw materials itself that may be coming from processing companies or farms. But, what country is this actually originating from? And then have you approve them as a supplier? But then think about, what is it going to take to get from your supplier to your receiving facility? So is it something that's domestic that's going to come on a refrigerated truck, or is this something that's going to cross the sea in a cargo container as well? And what type of hazards could be associated with that? And, one of the other FSMA rules for sanitary transport is certainly going to have an impact on that. So we want to make sure we take that into consideration as well. Most of the burden of the compliance and responsibilities falls on the processing companies and those that have to comply with the preventive control for human food rule. So we're certainly aware of that. We have to accept and fulfill that responsibility as well. And then again, for the redistributed products, for distributors or brokers, would have the FSVP compliance that's required. But then think about, once that product gets in a package and box, what's going to happen to it beyond that point as well, from your storage and distribution to the transportation to your customers. And again, sanitary transport rules apply to that as well. And then ultimately, how's it going to end up in the retail and the food service chains, and then ultimately to the consumers where it's actually going to be consumed. So think about that entire process and how do we make sure that we're doing all that we can to effectively control that as well. And then the other point I wanted to make here is just to consider the balancing act that's necessary between cost reduction and risk mitigation, because cost reduction is always a goal. And that's certainly okay and, commendable in most companies, that we're always thinking about what can we do to reduce our cost, and increase the profitability of the companies as well. And that's perfectly fine. But we have to make sure that we take all things into consideration through that process. Purchasing may be working with wanting to source a new raw or one of your existing raw materials from a new supplier, and maybe they want to import it from an international country instead of buying it domestically as you have in the past. And that may be perfectly fine, but it could introduce a new hazard, such as an intentional adulteration. So that's why it takes the team approach that Laura talked about to make sure everybody has an opportunity to weigh in on those potential risks and what are we going to do to control that as well. Or sometimes you see the situations. I was actually at a supplier one day, and I was just working in an office near the purchasing department, and the purchasing manager comes in and says, hey, we've got a supplier offering us a great deal on this particular lot of product, and we'll buy this load, and they can have it to us in like 2 hours. And the old saying, if it's too good to be true, it usually is. So, trust me, there's a reason somebody else rejected that load, and you may not want to assume those risks in your operations as well. So, look at it from both of those perspectives about, it's great to reduce costs where we can, but let's make sure we take everything into consideration when we're looking at that to mitigate that risk. And then, some of the considerations to do that is, we have to avoid that weak link. And that's what Laura talked about so well, that if you look at, all those steps in the supply chain and you think we've got 10 different steps and 9 of them may be great, but if one of those steps are a weak link that breaks, it could have a catastrophic impact on your overall company itself. Other ways to do it is you could specify acceptable geographic areas that you only want to source domestically or for particular countries, or maybe exclude certain countries as well, based on your own risk analysis as well. Make sure that your suppliers can indeed meet the required documentation, everything that you're going to ask for. We'll look at that on another slide in just a moment, and that they have acceptable audit scores and results as well. Make sure QA is involved in the process so they can do adequate due diligence of prospective suppliers. So, if you want to qualify a new supplier, make sure QA is involved in that process so they can do the research that may be necessary. But the bottom bullet here is really key, is just make sure that your new approval process for suppliers, really is a team approach. So as Laura talked about, was so important to get everyone involved, purchasing, QA, receiving departments, operations, even your R&D departments as they're developing these new products as well, to make sure everybody has a voice into that process and any concerns are taken into consideration as well. And ultimately, each one of those departments has an opportunity to sign off and approve that vendor to make sure that we do it in the right way as well. And then, of course, we have the SQF code, and in section 2.3.4 covers our approved suppliers and what we have to do. It gives us a lot of great information, and certainly the best practices to be able to go through this process. But we have to have written procedures that talk about how are we going to select, evaluate, approve, and monitor approved suppliers. So it's not just a one-time process to get them approved, but how are we going to monitor them on an ongoing basis as well. And then you have to have the approved supplier list, of course, the receiving records, and keep up with the supplier audits that are coming in. And then notice in 2342, it does talk about the approved supplier program must be based on supplier performance and risk levels. So it goes back exactly to what Laura said, that when you're doing that risk assessment on your approved supplier list, you ought to have an assessment for the likelihood, the severity, and the supplier performance to get that total risk rating to be able to comply with that part of the code as well. And then 2343 talks about a verification frequency of raw materials. So, if there is going to be some testing and inspections of raw materials, how often is that going to occur? Is it every lot that comes in? Are you going to periodically verify COAs, once a week, once a month, once a quarter? But you need to actually have a verification schedule for the frequency of the raw materials. And then a couple other sections to address emergency suppliers and sister sites. And then the last part to address the supplier audits based on risk themselves. And again, you see the word risk. So we have to be able to do that. You have to decide based on that risk assessment, are you going to require an updated audit on an annual basis, which would be the best practice. But, if you feel like you can justify, 2 years or 3 years, you need to have a risk assessment to document how frequent you're going to ask for those supplier audits as well, to be able to justify the decisions that you made in that area. And then on the right-hand side of this slide, it talks about all the documentation that you need to get from a supplier. And you need to make sure they can provide this for you. It starts with a contract and starts with specifications, which both should be mutually agreed upon. But then all the other information that comes with it, the technical data sheet, the letter of guarantee. I see someone already asked a question about letter of continuity. So that was a great question to throw in today. And we encourage all your questions. So, any other claims guarantee, is it gluten-free or kosher? How do they back that up? Their third-party audits, which should be updated annually, preferably. And then other information, it could be the allergen statements, but there's a whole list of information just depending upon the type of ingredient to make sure that they can provide all of that to you to show that they are going to be, truly a qualified and an approved supplier through this process. And then just really encourage you to have a lot of both breadth and depth to your supply chain and your approved supplier list itself. Laura did a great job covering this, so I won't go into too much detail here, but to make sure that you do have redundancy in your suppliers, that, in almost all cases, you don't want to rely on a single supplier for a particular raw material. So you have that duality that she spoke about as well, that we have multiple suppliers available. So we have backup to make sure that we can have a continuous supply of the materials that we need, and that you're getting the right price. That's the best way to do it, is if you have multiple suppliers that are competing against each other, to make sure you're getting the best price and a fair price for that as well. Make sure the suppliers have contingency plans in place so they can make sure they can give you ongoing continuity of the materials that you need and the volumes that you require to keep your operations going as well. And then we talked about the single supplier, to really be aware of that, God forbid they have a tornado that wipes out the facility or some other type of event that could occur. You don't want to leave yourself in a vulnerable position as a result of that as well. And then just make sure to look at those supplier lists and update those risk and the vulnerabilities on a regular basis as well. And then last in this section, we just want to talk about supplier verification, because we do know of all things, and we've learned over the last several years the hard way, that things can change, and they do change, and they often change very quickly. So, staying alert and looking ahead is the key, that we have to be able to stay alert to know what's going on in our industries, what's going on in the countries that are sourcing you the raw materials themselves, and what's happening with those individual suppliers that you've got. And then when they have recalls of their own, how do we know about that? Make sure that you have communication. And then looking ahead, those trends that Laura talked about, to make sure we understand, what's coming down the pike, not just what works today, but, what are those emerging trends over the course of the next year or two that we really need to prepare ourselves for as well. And then this slide brings you back to the FDA dashboard. I just wanted to share, a quicker example of the main menu options on this dashboard. And again, please do bookmark it and check it on a regular basis. You can also subscribe to a number of things, so it sends you email alerts from this as well. But it gives you a great way to use it for supplier verification as well. As notice the yellow button that says search firm information, that you can actually put your supplier's name in there and see if they've had any regulatory actions or recalls by FDA as well. So it's a great way just to double check. And remember the mantra is about trust but verify. If a supplier tells you they've done all these things and they haven't had a recall and they haven't had any 483s and all of that sounds great, well, verify it. Go on this list and look at, search their information and see what you come up with as well. But a lot of other great information. You can see, how many inspections and what types of inspections FDA is doing. How many times are they issuing warning letters through this process for the 483s, and who's getting a warning letter for what reasons. And you can use that as an opportunity to learn from their mistakes to avoid those at your same location as well. And then a lot of great information on imports and all as well. So just please take a look at that and make sure you stay abreast of it on a regular basis. And then other methods of verification, your internal supplier monitoring. I love to help our clients make sure they have a good supplier corrective action request process in place. So we call these SCARs. So it's a SCAR against each of your supplier as well. But, if a load comes in and it does have, busted bags, pallets that may be falling over, insanitary conditions, pest infestation, things like that, that's when you would write up these SCARs, and you're going to, state to your supplier, here's what the issue was, give it to them and ask them to complete a corrective action request. But more importantly, trend those. How many times do you have to issue them, and to each supplier as well? And that's part of that risk assessment that you do for each supplier through that process. And if you had one supplier with, 10 SCARs over the course of the year, that's certainly going to raise their risk ranking for you. So make sure you have a good process to manage that. External monitoring, there's great ways to stay informed. There's a lot of different sites that you can even sign up for alerts and, input company names or different information, product names and all. And you can get all kind of alerts for, when these suppliers may be ending up in the news, for recalls, regulatory events, certainly staying abreast of the the news media, food safety news does a great job to keep you informed, all the social medias, and there's different databases, for food fraud and intentional adulteration and all. So there's a lot of great resources, a lot of them free. So I encourage you to subscribe to those as well. Other methods of verification from a high risk supplier standpoint, it may be a good idea to do a second party audit. You can trust the third party audit, but if it's truly a high risk supplier, and you've got a lot of emphasis on that one location, then you may want to go see things for yourself as well. And then on the COAs, just don't take them for granted on a piece of paper. Certainly the Peanut Corporation of America taught us that as well, that, just because you read something on a piece of paper doesn't necessarily mean it's always true. So, even if you're requiring a COA from your vendors, I would periodically, do your own test and make sure that your results correlate with their results on a regular basis as well, to make sure it doesn't raise any questions about that. And then we already talked about FDA's verification methods and how you can do that. So those are all great methods of verification. And, you can also ask for the company's recall plans, crisis management plans as well, to see how that's been incorporated as part of the process too. And then just 2 more slides, and then we'll get to your questions here real quick. Just, areas of focus, what kind of things do we need to look for through this process? Regulatory compliance is always a foundation, not just here in the US, but also regulatory compliance, in the countries that you're importing from and exporting to as well. Allergens is a great example of that, here in the US, it used to be the big 8, now it's the big 9 allergens. But, as you're exporting to other countries, they have a lot of different allergens that are identified as well. So make sure that you keep up with, what are the regulatory requirements in those countries that you're sourcing materials from or exporting materials from as well. Food fraud is a huge issue for the industry. So, if you are importing products and raw materials from other countries, I would really encourage you to use, one of those tools like the food fraud database or Horizon Scan and others like that, to help you understand how many incidents of intentional adulteration have they had, and what countries have they originated from as well. So, it's a great method of verification also. And then we live in a global society now. So, we have to be aware of the news every day and think about the geopolitical sourcing impacts, in terms of what's the political climate in the country that you're bringing this in from, and the economic climate as well. And, how vulnerable is that? What's the possibility of companies that could be shut down or taken over at any given time as well? Labor shortages, we've certainly experienced that through COVID and other reasons as well. And just, beyond COVID, just the fact that, it's hard to get people to work anymore. And our company's really going to be able to produce the quantity of products that you want to make and need for your operations itself. Weather related events, we've certainly seen historic situations, including a hurricane coming into California this week. So, things that just haven't normally happened in the past that unfortunately are happening now. So we need to be aware of those. And if those are happening where your suppliers are, you need to certainly be aware of that as well, along with pandemic too. And then the last slide, we talk about, where to look. We mentioned the supplier communications. Laura mentioned the change management. That's so important. We had one of our clients that actually had a recall. They had bought the same raw material from the same supplier for 10 plus years, and they didn't change that raw material, but that supplier all of a sudden started making another product with a different allergen. They didn't tell their customer, and they had a cross contact situation occur. And, the client never knew they even had another allergen in their plant. And the supplier thought, well, we didn't need to tell you because it didn't impact the product you were buying. But actually it did impact their risk level, because now there was another allergen in that environment, and a cross contact situation occurred and then triggered another recall. So, as your suppliers change things, they need to inform you for sure. So make sure that you really keep in close communications with them on specs, recalls, any kind of changes. The recall alerts, again, you can sign up for those on the FDA website, USDA websites, and stay informed of any companies that are having recalls, along with the industry publications itself, economic analysis, government sources, and Google alerts. That's one source, a lot of other ways that you can do that as well. So we're going to open it up for questions. I do want to share just a couple things. Jonathan told you about the risk management collection that's on our ZOSI website, that's done by SQF. Again, a great resource to help you understand risk and how to control that on all these different specific topics as well. Of course, at Alchemy Consulting, we're always here to help you. Anything related to regulatory compliance, GFSI, and your training needs. Certainly happy to help you in your plant each and every time. And of course, the Alchemy training courses, give you a great resource to be able to train all your employees on workplace safety and food safety issues as well, and automate those training records for you. So, Jonathan, with that, I'll turn it back over to you, sir, and we can go through some questions.
Thanks. Wow. What a
lot of
great presentation with depth of content and keen insights. What a treat for our attendees today. All right, so we did have a couple questions that came in via the chat. Jeff, I know you referenced this one already, but I'd like for you to maybe go back to it and unpack it a little bit more. What are your thoughts, opinions of letters of continuity when it comes to risk?
Yeah, I think it's one arrow in your quiver, but certainly don't rely on that by itself. When you talk about the letters of guarantee and the letters of continuity, it's a statement by your suppliers that are saying that everything's, made for the purpose of use in food products and complies with regulatory requirements. But, that's just one topic. It doesn't give you a snapshot of what's happening at that company like a third-party audit report would do on an annual basis. It doesn't give you a lot of other information as well. So, certainly I think it's a good tool, but it definitely should not be the only tool that you use. So that would be one comment.
Great, thank you. All right, next question. What is the global or local method of choice for proper sampling size to represent the lot? And I think they reference ISO. So is there an ISO guideline for that?
Yeah, there are some ISO guidelines for that. The other ones I'd recommend even above the ISO would be the ASQ, the American Society of Quality, and the military standards. Are really the military standards are the most common ones that are used to help identify, what's an appropriate sampling size out of a particular lot size as well. Or Laura, if you want to chime in on that as well. No.
Mute.
Yeah.
Jeff, I agree with those references. I would also say you need to understand the product and what we're trying to test for, because typically microbes are not uniform. They are typically injured within the product, and they're inconsistent, and sometimes the product matrix can create an issue with the actual testing. So it's beyond just how big a sample size you need to take. I think there is a bigger question. So a lot to go into on that sampling. And so I would reach out to a laboratory and see what their thoughts are. Make sure your lab is accredited and get some advice from those folks.
Excellent. Next question. We are a USDA plant. Should we also download the link from the FDA?
I definitely think that would be a good idea, just to stay informed of, what's going on in the industry as a whole. There's an awful lot of companies that are out there that are, inspected by both FDA and USDA. They're dual jurisdiction type plants is what they call them. So, they could have a recall on the FDA side that didn't impact one of the USDA products. So you may not get that information from USDA, but you might find it out on the FDA side. So, overall, yeah, I think that's a great suggestion, and certainly a good idea to be able to do to stay informed of what's going on in the overall food industry itself.
Yeah, and Jeff, you highlighted that USDA also has their own database. It looks and feels a little differently, but there is information there to be had on USDA's side, particularly on recalls.
Yeah, and there is another site called foodsafety.gov, and that does a great job of consolidating some information between FDA and USDA, both on a central source. So I'd bookmark that one and take a look at it as well.
Great. All right, next question. How is FSVP different from a supplier approval program? Just want to understand the basic difference.
You know, they're both supplier approval programs, you know, as a whole. So it just depends on how they apply. You know, the FSVP specifically applies if you're importing and redistributing those products without any further processing of those ingredients themselves, then that's when the FSVP applies. You know, and for processing companies that are going to handle those ingredients and process them into further products, you know, that's when the preventive control for human food rule applies itself. But ultimately, they're both, you know, a vehicle to approve your suppliers. And through that process, you have to assess the risk of the food itself. And FSVP certainly focuses on the risk of the supplier in greater detail than the preventive control for human food. So.
Excellent. All right. I think last question for today. What are some real examples besides COVID of an unexpected change that we should be looking out for?
I can give a couple, and then if you want to
go ahead, Jeff.
You know, a great example is, you know, emerging trends and pathogens that are in the industry. That, you know, there was a recall of flour products, you know, about 3 years ago due to E. coli. And, you know, prior to that, E. coli had not really been considered to be a particular hazard associated with the flour products themselves. But then one particular supplier had a foodborne illness outbreak associated with that. So then all companies making flour had to do a reassessment to be able to assess that as a type of hazard as well. So, you know, sometimes new things and new hazards can emerge related to certain ingredients that you have to take into consideration. Other ones can be, you know, specific events like fires, tornadoes, storms, things like that, that could have a big impact on a particular supplier. But Laura, feel free.
Yeah, really good examples, Jeff. The example I would give, and it seems simple enough, but you know, all the technology that we're using and applying to test product, we're starting to get different detection limits, and they're getting tighter and tighter. So you may have a supplier in, you know, Thailand that is sending you results for pesticide free. They're testing, you get some analysis, but their detection limits are maybe 10, you know, they're not equal to the current detection limits that are here in the US. And so people find themselves at a difference, and then you start trying to reconcile that, and it comes down to not using the most current testing methodology. So, you know, we've got to keep up with just the emerging technology that's applied in the sampling world. And I think that's another area that people can get hung up on.
Great point.
Fantastic. Thank you both so very, very much. For those of you who by chance didn't attend last week's webinar, I would encourage you, from the content that you've seen today, go back and watch the recording. I mean, it's fantastic. And then also make sure you sign up for the last webinar in our series coming up, I believe, on September 6th. So looking forward to seeing everybody there. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Good luck.